나의 정체성을 결정짓는 가장 중요한 요소가 뭘까요? 20년 전만 해도 대부분의 사람들은 국적이라고 대답했을 것 같습니다. 한국인이냐 미국인이냐 유럽에서 나고 자랐느냐에 따라서 내 문화와 정체성 또는 생활 습관이 결정되는 부분이 많았던 것 같아요. 하지만 지금 2024년에 나의 정체성을 결정짓는 가장 큰 요소가 뭐냐라고 물어보면 아마 세대가 정답일 것 같아요. 우리나라도 꼰대, 나때는처럼 윗세대와 아랫세대의 문화 차이를 표현하는 단어가 있는 것처럼 영어권에서도 오케이 부머, 알았어요 베이비 부머 세대 사람이라고 하는 윗세대와의 갈등을 보여주는 용어가 있는 것을 봐서 지금은 나라 간의 문화 갈등보다 세대 간의 문화 갈등이 더 도드라지는 시기인 것 같아요. 근데 제가 어렸을 때를 생각해보면은 대체로 나보다 나이 많은 사람을 보면 저 사람은 우리 삼촌 연배다, 아버지 연배다, 할아버지 연배다, 그리고 나도 언젠가 나이가 들면은 그 사람들과 같은 위치가 되겠지 라는 식으로 나이에 대해서 생각을 했지만 지금은 Z세대, 밀레니얼 세대, 알파 세대처럼 각 세대가 고유한 특성을 가지고 있고 그 세대가 마치 따로따로 노는 것 같은 느낌을 주는 때에 살고 있는 것 같습니다. 제너레이션, 세대란 무엇인가 라는 제목으로 번역돼서 나온 책을 쓴 진 트윈즈 박사가 특히 밀레니얼, Z세대 그리고 알파 세대의 문화적 특성과 차이점에 대해서 가장 저명한 저술가 그리고 강사로 활동하고 있습니다. 그래서 진 트윈즈 박사와의 인터뷰를 통해서 밀레니얼, Z 그리고 알파 세대의 차이점 그리고 한국 MZ 세대와 또 미국 MZ 세대의 차이점 등을 직접 물어보기로 했습니다. What's actually fascinating fashion trend in South Korea right now called Y2K fashion. So the idea is that Gen Alphas are dressing like Gen Xers. And I thought this was a very South Korean thing, but it seems that it's a thing in the US as well, because I recently saw a TikTok video made by American teenagers that said back in 2000, if you wore a knee socks and all your friends were wearing ankle socks, you're wearing dad socks. But now all the Gen Alphas are wearing knee socks and they see a friend wearing an ankle socks and they make fun of her saying, are you like an elder millennial or something?
Oh, the generational conflict starts so early now. That's the funny thing. You know, it used to be it would take a lot longer before you get those generational fights. Now you're definitely getting them between Gen Z and millennials in terms of what's in fashion. And then what I learned recently from my own Gen Z kids is there's also this thing about them criticizing Gen Alpha. So Gen Zers called Gen Alpha crusty iPad kids. That's what they're always talking about. Because it's true, you know, that's the first generation to never know a world without the iPad. But I guess they don't wash their hands before they use it. That's why it gets crusty.
우리나라에서는 MZ 세대라는 말이 있죠. 그래서 막상 그 세대에 속한 분들은 M과 Z가 얼마나 다른데 우리를 하나로 묶어 부르냐라고 하지만 저는 거기에 이유가 있다고 생각합니다. 우리나라의 역사적 특성상 1989년 이전의 가치관이 형성된 세대와 그 이후의 가치관이 형성된 세대는 정말 다를 수밖에 없다고 생각을 해요. 이 89년에 우리나라에 정말 많은 일이 있었죠. 그 이전에 우리나라는 전 세계가 자본주의 진영과 공산주의 진영으로 나뉘어서 대치한 냉전에 북한과 대치하고 있는 최전방 나라였습니다. 그렇기 때문에 일종의 요새 국가라고 할 수 있었고 그 요새 국가인 만큼 내셔널리즘이라든지 단체주의가 한국 문화의 굉장히 중요한 부분일 수밖에 없었어요. 근데 1988년에 올림픽 유치를 통해서 세계 문화를 경험하게 됐고 또 1989년에 베를린 장벽이 무너지고 일반 여권이 주어지면서 일반 사람들이 해외여행을 다니면서 많은 문화를 경험하게 되죠. 또 여러 가지 소비 문화에 대한 수입 제한이 풀리면서 일본, 미국, 유럽에서 굉장히 많은 대중문화가 쏟아져 들어오면서 닫혀있는 요새 같은 마인드인 대한민국에서 자란 사람과 세계에 열려있는 대한민국에서 자란 사람 사이에는 정말 깊은 골짜기가 있을 수밖에 없다는 생각이 듭니다. You say the generations are turning over faster, but in South Korea, we actually put the millennials and the Gen Z together and call them
really?
the MZ generation. There was a very funny sitcom called MZ Corporate Office. It's basically a sitcom where all the employees are millennials or Gen Z, except for like head manager of the department. And the idea was basically like you're saying, the millennials and the Gen Z are overprotected. So they seemed like middle school kids. And they were coming into the office. Some writer imagined an office filled with people who look like adults but think like high school kids. And how would this company function? But I think there is actually a very good reason for a lot of Koreans to think that a big cultural break came in 1988. Because we were at the forefront of the Cold War with North Korea being just next to us. It was very militaristic society. And in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. So the entire world changed for Koreans. In 1989, Western culture started pouring into South Korea. And then the Gen Xers who were fully into the American consumer culture and millennials who were into the technology culture. But the US is a Western country. So you cannot define generation in terms of like traditional culture versus Western culture. What would you think is the biggest factor that distinguishes the generations between them in terms of, who's a baby boomer, who's a Gen X, and who's a millennial, and who's a Gen Z?
Well, the lines between those generations are somewhat arbitrary. In particular, that line between boomers and Gen Xers and millennials, there's some gray areas in there. You could move those years, a little bit up or down and make a good argument. Where I do see a really pronounced generational break is between millennials and Gen Z in the US.
Wow.
Because millennials, very, very self-confident, optimistic. Most of the time during their adolescence, mental health statistics most of them were getting better. Depression and suicide were going down. And then that all changes really quick around that early 2010s, about 2012 period. And that's the transition between millennials and Gen Z, where much more pessimism, depression goes up, all of these things change, expectations go down. So many of these indicators have that turning point right around 2012 with this pronounced break between those generations. I think a lot of that is due to the introduction of the smartphone and the growth of social media. When we look at the other generational transitions, the ones that are not as sudden but still happen, a lot of that is from individualism. And you have to say, well, then, why did individualism change? Why was there more focus on the self and less on social rules? Technology has a lot to do with that as well, because technology makes individualism possible. That when you have labor-saving devices, then it allows people to be more independent. Having fewer children, the kids grow to independence later. That also happens because of technology at its root, because longer lives come from better medical care. And birth control allows you to have fewer children. So a lot of these things at the root come back to technology in one way or another. So I think that is the biggest driver of generational change, at least here in the US.
이 책의 중요한 요점 중에 하나는 이 세대 차이가 왜 일어나는지예요. 진 트윈지 박사에 의하면 세대 차이는 결국 기술 발전 때문에 일어난다라고 하는데, 기술 발전 때문에 두 가지 문화적 변화가 생긴다고 합니다. 하나는 개인주의 발전이고, 하나는 사람들이 성인이 되는 시기를 점점 더 늦춘다라는 거예요. 이거를 슬로우 라이프 스트래티지라고 진 트윈지 박사는 불러요. 일단 기술 발전이 왜 개인주의를 발전시키는지를 한번 볼게요. 옛날에는 빨래를 하거나 요리를 하거나 가사를 하는 일 자체가 너무너무나도 힘든 일이었기 때문에 대체로 사람들은 대가족에서 협동으로 가사를 분담하면서 생활을 했고, 그런 환경에서 나는 내 맘대로 살래 라고 하기가 굉장히 어렵죠. 하지만 여러 가지 가전제품과 기술의 발전으로 가사에 필요한 모든 것이 갖춰져 있는 1인용 오피스텔에 사는 것 같은 삶의 형태가 가능해지면서 내 맘대로 혼자 살 거야 라고 생각을 하는 사람들이 훨씬 더 많아지면 개인주의가 점점 강력해질 수밖에 없다고 하고요. There was a paper written in a social psychology journal in Korea back in 2006 when the millennials were, just in their early 20s, about whether they share some of the same Confucian values as the older generation. So one of the questions was, a family needs at least one male child to carry the family name. Agree or disagree? 75.5% of people over 60 agreed. Only 16.8% of people under 20 agreed. When you get married, it's because you intend to have kids. To this question, 80.9% of people were 60 agreed, as opposed to only 6.9% of people under 20 agreed. And now these kids have grown up and they are putting their money where their mouth is. They're not having children. Korea has the lowest birth rate anywhere in the world. But it seems that in the US, in the UK, in Europe, the millennials and Gen Z, they're not marrying, they're not dating, they're not having kids. Most of the analysis around this in South Korea has been about economic situation specific to South Korea. But if this is a worldwide trend, it must be more of a generational thing.
So it's always, there's always been a fair amount of individualism in the West, but now there's a lot more. And that trend has really spread even to cultures that have traditionally been much more collectivistic or Confucian. That the idea is you're not going to get married and have kids because that's what the culture's telling you to do, or that your parents are telling you to do, that you're going to do your own thing and you're going to do what you want. and that getting married and having children is a choice. And when it's presented that way, particularly I think in our current culture of so much negativity, especially on social media, a lot more young people are saying, that's too risky. That's not for me. That's not something that I want to do. For example, having children, that you have to sacrifice a lot of time, money, and effort of your own to put into your kids. So it seems pretty clear to me that it's not purely economic, given that, just as you said, this is something that's happening around the world. In the US, for example, median incomes for younger adults are at all-time highs, even when adjusted for inflation. There's definitely some challenges. A lot of those income gains have been for women. So that means who's going to not work, maybe when you have a child. And then if you're both going to work, how are you going to pay for childcare? So there's some truth to some of those economic challenges. But in polls, when younger adults who don't have children and say they don't want to have or have children are asked why, the reasons are always some version of, I don't want to, or I want to put my time and money into something else. So even if there's some underlying economic things, it doesn't seem to be the primary reason for the birth rate going down in so many countries.
And it seemed interesting in your book that when the millennials were asked, if all things being perfect, would you like to have a child? They said yes.
Mm-hmm.
But the Gen Z, when they were asked, all things being perfect, would you like to have a child? They still said no.
Exactly. Yeah. So that question's been asked in these surveys of 18-year-olds since 1976.
Mm-hmm.
And people saying, yeah, everything being perfect, I want to have kids. That's been really high, like in the 95th percentile for a really long time. And then it started to fall in that transition between millennials and Gen Z. And that's particularly interesting because we all know already what happened with the birth rate with millennials. So at 18, they were like, yeah, all things being good, I want to have kids. And then they didn't. Gen Z isn't even saying that at 18. So that really suggests that the birth rate's going to continue to go down. And if that's going to cause societal problems, that we got to figure out, why that is and how to change it.
Mm-hmm. 이 세대 변화의 두 번째 축은 기술 변화에 따른 슬로우 라이프 스트래티지라는 건데 정서적 독립과 성장의 나이가 점점 높아진다는 거예요. 이건 왜 일어나냐 하면은 치사율이 낮아지면서 일어난대요. 의학기술이 발달하면서 오늘날처럼 내가 8, 90까지 살 수 있게 되었고 또 내가 아이를 낳았을 때 이 아이가 성인까지 건강하게 살아남을 가능성이 거의 100%다 라고 하는 사회에서는 어떻게 되느냐? 아이를 당연히 늦게 낳게 되고 그 아이를 하나만 낳게 되고 아이가 하나만 있으면 부모가 그 한 아이한테 더 많은 시간과 돈과 교육을 투자할 수 있기 때문에 그 아이들은 대체로 대학에 가거나 대학원에 갈 수 있고 그렇기 때문에 일을 시작하거나 독립을 하는 나이가 점점 늦어지게 된다는 거죠. If I could make one-to-one correlation between the generations in the US and generations in Korea, I think the baby boomers and the Gen X came a little later in South Korea than in the US. Because the World War II ended in 1945 for the US, Korean War in 1951, so our post-war reconstruction began in the decade that followed in the 1960s.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of the problems with the Gen Z that you describe came to Korea before it hit the US. And I can think of a couple of reasons why.
The data definitely backs you up on that. Like having a smartphone, for example, that was more common in Korea before it was common in the US.
So a lot of Korean parents, my parents included, send their kids over to the US to spend their youth there. And, I spent my youth in the US back in 1994, drag racing, cars from junkyard in mall parking lot, hanging out in malls, drinking slush, and sometimes getting in fights with guys from neighboring high school, all that American teenage life entails. But reading from your book, it seems that that's not the teenage life in the US anymore.
It's not. It's really, really changed. I think you got the last wave of that teenage life of kids, driving around just to drive around with their friends and getting in fights and getting drunk, spending a lot of time with their friends in person while their parents often didn't know where they were. And that is just not as common anymore. So all of those things have gone down in that transition between millennials and Gen Z. And these are not all bad or good. I always want to make sure that that's clear. I'm not suggesting it's a great thing for teens to have gotten in fights and gotten drunk all the time. There's trade-offs, to any cultural trend. So Gen Z, just a lot less likely to drink alcohol. they're also just less likely to do those adult things. So less likely to have a driver's license or a job, or less likely to go out on dates, or less likely to have sex. So just a lot of those adult things, they do them later. They're less likely to do those during high school, more likely to put those things off until they're older. And that has some clear advantages. It has the downside, though, that they are less independent. They're reaching adulthood without as many experiences with independence and having to make decisions. A lot of times those decisions weren't the greatest decisions, as it sounds like you experienced. But
Right.
I bet you learned from them.
I did.
Yeah. And they're not that's just much less likely to happen now.
근데 이 슬로우 라이프 스트래테지로 가는 과정이 흥미로운 게 뭐냐면 X세대와 Z세대 사이에서 굉장히 반대 방향으로 나타났다고 합니다. X세대 같은 경우에는 우리가 딱 떠올라도 세븐틴이나 비트 같은 걸로 대표되는 가장 거친 청년기를 보낸 세대로 기억이 되고 있고요. Z세대는 남을 배려해야 되고 민폐를 끼치면 안 된다는 사고방식을 가진 X세대에 비하면 소극적이라고도 할 수 있는 세대가 되었는데 이 두 가지가 다 이 슬로우 라이프 스트래테지의 다른 양상이라고 진 트윈즈 박사는 얘기를 해요.
And what was the cultural change that prompted that? What baffles me is the Gen Z are children of the Gen Xers, right? And Gen Xers are supposed to be the wildest generation in American or even Korean or Japanese history. So what happened there? How did Gen X bike gang parents raise the Gen Z children?
So, Gen X was a little bit of an exception in a longer term trend. So when people live longer and when healthcare is better and when education takes longer to finish, parents tend to make the choice to have fewer children and nurture them more carefully. And children grow to independence later. So that's been a parental attitude that has been more common in Asia than the US for quite a while. And the US kind of caught up. But there was this kind of bump in the road with Gen X, that Gen X as young adults followed that strategy of getting married later, having kids later than boomers and silent generation before them. But they had this shorter childhood and this crazy adolescence with lots of teen pregnancy and high crime rate and all the so a lot of the things that you're describing of teens, just doing all kinds of crazy stuff. But then they got back on that train of that slower life strategy as young adults. And that was it. They were pretty much the last generation to really have that crazy adolescence. Some millennials had it too, but then Gen Z, it just became a lot less common. So it's really part of this bigger cultural story that there's just been this shift in parenting and in childhood. What's fascinating to me as a researcher is that it's not just parents, it's in the whole culture. Because if you're a parent who thinks my kid should have more independence, they need to walk home from school, I'm going to let them cook, you could get arrested. I mean, the laws have changed to say kids can't be left unattended at home until they're 14 or 15 years old. That's the law that I think that in Illinois, I believe they changed the law to be that. And there's been many cases of people who have left a kid in a car for like 5 minutes and then they get in trouble, or they let their 10-year-old walk home from a park a mile away and they get arrested. I mean, it's the cultural norm has shifted so much. When Gen Xers, all the things I've been describing, that was our childhood. I'm a Gen Xer. And it was this idea of like, your parents don't, by the time you're like 11, your parents really know where you are most of the time. The Netflix series, Stranger Things captures some of that. That's actually one of the reasons I think that became so popular is, it's a great story. And so younger people liked it, but Gen Xers watched this and it was their childhood. And there's a scene in that series where, I don't know, one of the kids shows up at the other's house and says, hey, where are X, Y, and Z? And then the parents are like, I don't know, weren't they with you? And they have no idea where their kids went. And that was how it was.
There was a trending sentence on Twitter. Somebody said that I was babysitting neighbor's kids when I was 13. Now 13-year-old kids need babysitters.
Exactly. That's exactly how it's different. And, again, there's trade-offs. There's some big advantages to protecting kids for longer, but it also means that if you teach high school or you teach college or you're someone who's hiring entry-level workers, you have this feeling that 22-year-olds now look like what 18-year-olds used to look like, and 18-year-olds look like what 15-year-olds used to look like. and it takes some getting used to.
네, 저는 이 책을 읽다가 좀 궁금한 점이 있었습니다. 오늘날 고등학생들은 옛날에 비해서 내가 극단적인 좌파다 또는 극단적인 우익이다 라고 대답하는 확률이 훨씬 더 높아졌다고 합니다. 또 하나 Z세대에서 나타난 미국에서의 변화 중에 하나가 뭐냐면 옛날에는 당신의 정체성을 정의하는 것 중에 가장 중요한 게 뭐예요? 라고 물어보면 대부분의 사람들이 뭐 나의 교육 수준, 나의 성격, 나의 가치관 이런 걸로 대답을 했다면 지금은 훨씬 더 많은 비율이 나는 아시아인입니다. 나는 흑인입니다. 나는 라틴계입니다. 라고 자기 인종에 대해서 얘기를 한다고 그래요.
If some high school kid or a college freshman said, I am extreme left or I'm extreme right, like everybody would be like, what? Like, and he's proud of that. He's proud of being extreme. You know, that's not cool, man. You know, that's what we would have said. But why a country that's becoming, in a culture that's becoming more individualistic, are people identifying more with extreme ideologies that often are more like collectivistic ideologies?
Why do you think the extremes would be more collectivistic? Do you mean, say, people on the left, say, embracing socialist ideas, that type of thing?
Yes, generally because we think of extreme right as being a nationalist and people on the extreme left being communist. I mean, maybe that also is a Gen X idea because I grew up before the Berlin Wall fell. So maybe I'm transposing my own idea of left and right, onto younger generation who don't see it that way. But the extreme political ideology to me seems like, oh, my party's going to vote this way, so I'm going to vote this way. So I see extremism as being more collectivistic that way.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And there's an interesting paradox too in the data that there's more people identify at the political extremes, but there's also a lot more people who identify as independent, say, rather than Republican or Democrat here in the US. So you have polarization, but then you've also got, I don't want to belong to that group. And so that piece, I think, is also individualistic. But I see what you mean about the extremes potentially being, a little bit more of a strong group identity, more of a collectivistic idea.
Okay, so our time's almost up. So last question, we need your wisdom. So I guess the big question is that acknowledging the difference between generations is all fine and good, but we are still a society and we all need to live together. And, saying that millennials are this way or boomers are that way are useful starting point for beginning to understand each other. But what do you suggest in order to bring all these generations together to make a society that functions again?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because I think that's really the key, is to get away from these narratives about whose fault is it and who's to blame and the finger pointing and the idea that, everything is all bad. Think about all the great things that have changed in a really good direction. How much longer people live is a great example, that we don't have to spend all day doing laundry over an open fire, stirring it and having to have five people spend all day just to do one family's laundry. I mean, that's how it used to be, and now we have the washing machine. We just throw stuff in and then go do something else. We have so much more freedom and leisure time than we used to. So we have to realize that two things are true. Yes, there's some big downsides to the current time and the way we live, but there's also some really, really big upsides. Both are true. And that with generations, it shouldn't be about fault or blaming or criticism, that we're all in this together. And let's try to understand each other better and take each other's perspectives. I mean, that's one of the biggest reasons why I wrote the book, was trying to understand each generation's perspective. Try to be empathic and think about what someone younger or older than you, how they grew up. And it's going to be different from the way that you grew up. That's not a bad or good thing. It just is.
사실 우리가 요즘 세대에 관련된 용어를 굉장히 많이 쓰지만 대부분의 세대 관련 용어들은 미국 사회학에서 우리가 수입해서 쓰는 경우가 많고요. 그렇기 때문에 밀레니얼, Z세대 같은 걸 만든 나라에서 이런 세대들이 어떻게 정의되고 있는지를 우리나라와 빗대어 보는 컨텐츠가 굉장히 재밌을 거라고 생각했습니다. 또 이 책에 보면은 우리나라와 비슷한 양상으로 세대들이 지나가긴 하지만 우리나라와 어떻게 결이 살짝 다르고 이 세대를 나누는 선이 조금씩 어떻게 다른지도 점검할 수 있는 기회였다고 생각을 해요. 하지만 개개인의 삶은 세대의 대세와 다른 방식으로도 나아갈 수 있기 때문에 쭉 읽다 보면은 X세대는 이런 아이들이 많아서 정서가 이렇게 됐다 라고 딱 할 때 이거 난데? 그래서 내가 이렇구나 라고 나와 대조해서 보면은 굉장히 흥미로운 독서가 된다고 생각해서 오늘 책 소개해 봤습니다. 탐구생활은 여기서 마무리하고요. 다음번엔 더 재밌는 문화 역사 이야기로 찾아뵙겠습니다. 안녕히 계십시오.